This is the chapter, you guys. This is it. They are finally going to be coming back together. Reunited feels so good. I think so. Well, maybe at least for Gatsby, because Daisy doesn't know. But let's see. Hi, everybody. I'm Mrs. Brown, and today we're going to be diving into Chapter 5 of The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So let's picture something, okay? Picture something you've been looking forward to for a long time. Maybe it's a prom, maybe it's a graduation, maybe it's a wedding, maybe it's that. But I want it to be like a specific date. I don't want it to be like long term, okay? So what does that look like? What is going to happen minute by minute? And I want you to then take that and it times it by 500, and that's kind of how Gatsby has been for the last however many years. So let's go ahead and dive on in.
Chapter 5. When I came home to West Egg that night, I was afraid, for a moment, that my house was on fire. 2 o'clock, and the whole corner of the peninsula was blazing with light, which fell unreal on the shrubbery and made thin, elongating glints upon the roadside wires. Turning a corner, I saw that it was Gatsby's house, lit from tower to cellar. At first I thought it was another party, a wild rout that had resolved itself into hide-and-go-seek or sardines in the box, with all the house thrown open to the game. But there wasn't a sound, only wind in the trees, which blew the wires and made the lights go off and on again as if the house had winked into the darkness. As my taxi groaned away, I saw Gatsby walking toward me across his lawn. "Your place looks like the World's Fair," I said. "Does it?" He turned his eyes toward it absently. "I have been glancing into some of the rooms. Let's go to Coney Island, old sport, in my car."
Gatsby and his house have become lit up now that he knows that Daisy is within reach. 5 years of planning, and it's finally all about to come to fruition. He's a little excited.
"It's too late." "Well, suppose we take a plunge in the swimming pool. I haven't made use of it all summer." "I've got to go to bed." "All right." He waited, looking at me with suppressed eagerness. "I talked to Miss Baker," I said after a moment. "I'm going to call up Daisy tomorrow and invite her over here to tea." "Oh, that's all right," he said carelessly. "I don't want to put you to any trouble." "What day would suit you?" "What day would suit you?" He corrected me quickly. "I don't want to put you to any trouble, you see." "How about the day after tomorrow?" He considered for a moment. Then, with reluctance, "I want to get the grass cut," he said. We both looked at the grass. There was a sharp line where my ragged lawn ended and the darker, well-kept expanse of his began. I suspected that he meant my grass.
I love this. Gatsby's trying to act as if his entire life's work isn't this big, huge deal, but it's the only thing that's been motivating him this entire time. He desperately wants to see Daisy, but he's been building this dream in his head for 5 years, and it has to be perfect in his head. But what does that kind of say about his personality?
"There's another little thing," he said uncertainly, and hesitated. "Would you rather put it off for a few days?" I asked. "Oh, it isn't about that. At least," he fumbled with a series of beginnings. "Well, I thought—" "Why, look here, old sport. You don't make much money, do you?" "Not very much." This seemed to reassure him, and he continued more confidently. "I thought you didn't, if you pardon my... You see, I carry on a little business on the side, a sort of sideline, you understand? And I thought that if you didn't make very much... You're selling bonds, aren't you, old sport?" "Trying to." "Well, this would interest you. It wouldn't take up much of your time, and you might pick up a nice bit of money. It happens to be a rather confidential sort of thing." I realize now that under different circumstances that conversation might have been one of the crises of my life. But because the offer was obviously and tactlessly for a service to be rendered, I had no choice except to cut him off there. "I've got my hands full," I said. "I'm much obliged, but I couldn't take on any more work." "You wouldn't have to do any business with Wolfsheim." Evidently thought I was shying away from the connection mentioned at lunch, but I assured him he was wrong. He waited a moment longer, hoping I'd begin a conversation, but I was too absorbed to be responsive. So he went unwillingly home.
Well, this is so sad. Gatsby doesn't understand that people can do things out of the goodness of their hearts, or that they just want to do it in order to be nice. He's so used to people using him that he sees it as an expectation.
The evening had made me lightheaded and happy. I think I walked into a deep sleep as I entered my front door, so I don't know whether or not Gatsby went to Coney Island, or for how many hours he glanced into rooms while his house blazed gaudily on. I called up Daisy from the office next morning and invited her to come to tea. Don't bring Tom, I warned her. What? Don't bring Tom. Who is Tom? She asked innocently.
All right, this is more of a joke. She's gone along with Nick's request to not bring Tom, but it's kind of tasteless.
The day agreed upon was pouring rain. At 11 o'clock, a man in a raincoat dragging a lawnmower tapped on my front door and said that Mr. Gatsby had sent him over to cut my grass. This reminded me that I had forgotten to tell my Finn to come back, so I drove into West Egg Village to search for her among soggy whitewashed alleys and to buy some cups and lemons and flowers. The flowers were unnecessary, for at 2 o'clock a greenhouse arrived from Gatsby's with innumerable receptacles to contain it. An hour later, the front door opened nervously, and Gatsby, in a white flannel suit, silver shirt, and gold-colored tie, hurried in. He was pale, and there were dark signs of sleeplessness beneath his eyes. Is everything all right? He asked immediately. The grass looks fine, if that's what you mean. What grass? He inquired blankly. Oh, the grass in the yard. He looked out the window at it, but, judging from his expression, I don't believe he saw a thing. Looks very good, he remarked vaguely. One of the papers said they thought the rain would stop about 4. I think it was the Journal. Have you got everything you need in the shape of tea? I took him into the pantry, where he looked a little reproachfully at the Finn. Together we scrutinized the 12 lemon cakes from the delicatessen shop. Will they do? I asked. Of course, they're fine. And he added hollowly, old sport.
So remember back at the beginning, Gatsby's nerves are now getting the best of him. This is what he's been working on for years and years and years, and the reality is freaking him out. So picture something that you've been looking forward to, a prom, a graduation, a wedding. What does it look like? What's going to happen minute by minute? And that's what's going on in Gatsby's head.
The rain cooled about 3:30 to a damp mist, through which occasional thin drops swam like dew. Gatsby looked with vacant eyes through a copy of Clay's Economics, starting at the finished tread that shook the kitchen floor, and peering toward the bleared windows from time to time as if a series of invisible but alarming happenings were taking place outside. Finally he got up and informed me in an uncertain voice that he was going home. Why's that? Nobody's coming to tea. It's too late. He looked at his watch as if there was some pressing demand on his time elsewhere. I can't wait all day. Don't be silly. It's just 2 minutes to 4.
Oh, the poor pumpkin. He is completely freaking out. Give him a hug.
He sat down miserably, as if I had pushed him, and simultaneously there was the sound of a motor turning into my lane. We both jumped up, and, a little harrowed myself, I went out into the yard. Under the dripping bare lilac trees, a large open car was coming up the drive. It stopped. Daisy's face, tipped sideways beneath a 3-cornered lavender hat, looked out at me with a bright, ecstatic smile. Is this absolutely where you live, my dearest one? The exhilarating ripple of her voice was a wild tonic in the rain. I had to follow the sound of it for a moment, up and down, with my ear alone, before any words came through. A damp streak of hair lay like a dash of blue paint across her cheek, and her hand was wet with glistening drops as I took it to help her from the car. Are you in love with me? She said low in my ear. Or why did I have to come alone? That's the secret of Castle Rackrent. Tell your chauffeur to go far away and spend an hour.
Here, Daisy's voice is mentioned yet again to remind readers that her voice is like a siren song and it lures people in to make them think that she's much closer to them than they really are. And Nick, her cousin, is also influenced by it. And she's curious as to why Nick was so adamant about her coming without Tom. And remember, she has no idea that Gatsby is waiting for her. I mean, how would you react if you were ambushed like this? I don't like surprises. I would not be happy whatsoever.
Come back in an hour, Ferdy. Then, in a grave murmur, his name's Ferdy. Does the gasoline affect his nose? I don't think so, she said innocently. Why? We went in. To my overwhelming surprise, the living room was deserted.
Wait, what? Gatsby left. But is it so strange? Remember, this reunion has to fit into his vision, and he's doing everything in his power to make sure it works out. He always wanted it to be as if fate had brought them back together, based upon what Jordan said earlier.
Oh, that's funny, I exclaimed. What's funny? She turned her head as there was a light, dignified knocking at the front door. I went out and opened it. Gatsby, pale as death, with his hands plunged like weights in his coat pockets, was standing in a puddle of water, glaring tragically into my eyes. With his hands still in his coat pockets, he stalked by me into the hall, turned sharply as if he were on a wire, and disappeared into the living room. It wasn't a bit funny. Aware of the loud beating of my own heart, I pulled the door to, against the increasing rain. For half a minute there wasn't a sound. Then, from the living room, I heard a sort of choking murmur, and part of a laugh, followed by Daisy's voice on a clear, artificial note. I certainly am awfully glad to see you again.
You know, get to see what Gatsby's vision was. He's all dressed up. There's flowers everywhere. We knew that he was just going to happen by, but no, he's just happening by. Why? This way, it seems as if fate, again, has brought them back together. And this explains why he always had the parties. His entire home and grounds were supposed to be perfect in case Daisy came by, and they were reunited that way, which makes sense why it looks like a set.
A pause. It endured horribly. I had nothing to do in the hall, so I went to the room. Gatsby, his hands still in his pockets, was reclining against the mantelpiece in a strained counterfeit of perfect ease, even of boredom. His head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of a defunct mantelpiece clock, and from this position his distraught eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting, frightened but graceful, on the edge of a stiff chair. We've met before, muttered Gatsby.
Oh, this is not going well. Gatsby's all acting all nonchalant, but it's like super awkward. And Daisy is completely shocked, as she should be, as anyone would be, and she doesn't know what to do. And, you know, I'm usually not Daisy's biggest fan, but in this case, like, my heart is breaking for her, and I have, like, secondhand embarrassment for Gatsby. This is rough, and Gatsby's just, like, trying way too hard to be smooth. It's a disaster.
His eyes glanced momentarily at me, and his lips parted with an abortive attempt at a laugh. Luckily, the clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his head, whereupon he turned and caught it with trembling fingers and set it back in place. Then he sat down, rigidly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand. I'm sorry about the clock, he said.
Okay, this is strange. Why is Daisy frightened? Why frightened? That really concerns me. And then it's interesting that the clock doesn't work, and so it's frozen in time. And how is it significant that the clock isn't working? I mean, what does the frozen clock represent in this scene? I mean, who does the frozen clock represent in this scene? I mean, Gatsby's also just frozen in time. He knocks the clock over and he does catch it. So we could look at this very, like English teachery here and like English major. Like, how is this a metaphor for what he's trying to do with Daisy? And what is this foreshadow about what will happen in their relationship?
My own face had now assumed a deep tropical burn. I couldn't muster up a single commonplace out of the 1,000 in my head. It's an old clock, I told them idiotically. I think we all believed for a moment that it had smashed in pieces on the floor. We haven't met for many years, said Daisy, her voice as matter-of-fact as it could ever be. 5 years next November. The automatic quality of Gatsby's answer set us all back at least another minute.
I really feel for them in this moment. Daisy is in shock, and she's trying to smooth over the situation. Gatsby's trying to be, like, way too cool. And he's just screwing it up with the whole clock accident, and then he's sounding like a complete stalker with how long it's been since they last saw each other, and Nick's totally third-wheeling it here.
I had them both on their feet with the desperate suggestion that they'd help me make tea in the kitchen when the demonic Finn brought it in on a tray. Amid the welcome confusion of cups and cakes, a certain physical decency established itself. Gatsby got himself into a shadow, and, while Daisy and I talked, looked conscientiously from one to the other of us with tense, unhappy eyes.
Question. Does Daisy want to see him, or has she moved on? And what evidence supports this? She's totally moved on. I mean, she got married, she had a kid. She chose to go.
However, as calmness wasn't an end in itself, I made an excuse at the first possible moment and got to my feet. "Where are you going?" demanded Gatsby in immediate alarm. "I'll be back. I've got to speak to you about something before you go." He followed me wildly into the kitchen, closed the door, and whispered, "Oh, God," in a miserable way. "What's the matter?" "This is a terrible mistake," he said, shaking his head from side to side. "A terrible, terrible mistake."
I feel so bad for him. Oh God, he said in a miserable way. I always just, I always feel so bad. I mean, his dream is just crumbling. He probably believed that Daisy would like jump into his arms and leave her husband and child and they'd live happily ever after. And she's just all like, "Hi. We haven't seen each other in a while."
"You're just embarrassed, that's all." And luckily, I added, "Daisy's embarrassed too." "She's embarrassed?" he repeated, incredulously. "Just as much as you are. Don't talk so loud." "You're acting like a little boy," I broke out impatiently. "Not only that, but you're rude. Daisy's sitting in there all alone." He raised his hand to stop my words, looked at me with unforgettable reproach, and, opening the door cautiously, went back into the other room. I walked out the back way, just as Gatsby had when he had made his nervous circuit of the house half an hour before, and ran for a huge black knotted tree whose massed leaves made a fabric against the rain. Once more it was pouring, and my irregular lawn, well shaved by Gatsby's gardener, abounded in small, muddy swamps and prehistoric marshes. There was nothing to look at from under the tree except Gatsby's enormous house. So I stared at it, like Kant at his church steeple, for half an hour. A brewer had built it early in the period craze a decade before, and there was a story that he'd agreed to pay 5 years' taxes on all the neighboring cottages if the owners would have their roofs thatched with straw. Perhaps their refusal took the heart out of his plan to found a family. He went into an immediate decline. His children sold his house with the black wreath still on the door. Americans, while occasionally willing to be serfs, have always been obstinate about being peasantry. After half an hour, the sun shone again, and the grocer's automobile rounded Gatsby's drive with the raw material for his servant's dinner. I felt sure he wouldn't eat a spoonful. A maid began opening the upper windows of his house, appeared momentarily in each, and, leaning from a large central bay, spat meditatively into the garden. It was time I went back. While the rain continued, it had seemed like the murmur of their voices, rising and swelling a little now and then with gusts of emotion. But in the new silence, I felt that silence had fallen within the house, too.
I love this. The weather is reflecting the mood. Remember that Fitzgerald uses the season and therefore the weather to subconsciously influence the reader's mood.
I went in, after making every possible noise in the kitchen short of pushing over the stove, but I don't believe they heard a sound. They were sitting at either end of the couch, looking at each other as if some question had been asked or was in the air, and every vestige of embarrassment was gone. Daisy's face was smeared with tears, and when I came in she jumped up and began wiping at it with her handkerchief before a mirror. But there was a change in Gatsby that was simply confounding. He literally glowed. Without a word or gesture of exaltation, a new well-being radiated from him and filled the little room.
We have a breakthrough! I love it. Once the awkwardness subsided, it appears as if they were finally able to talk. And Daisy's been crying. But what can we infer about the conversation based upon how Gatsby's reacting?
"Oh, hello, old sport," he said, as if he hadn't seen me for years. I thought for a moment he was going to shake hands. It stopped raining.
It stopped raining literally and figuratively.
"Has it?" When he realized what I was talking about, that there were twinkle bells of sunshine in the room, he smiled, like a weatherman, like an ecstatic patron of recurrent light, and repeated the news to Daisy. "What do you think of that? It's stopped raining." "I'm glad, Jay." Her throat, full of aching, grieving beauty, told only of her unexpected joy. "I want you and Daisy to come over to my house," he said. "I'd like to show her around." "You sure you want me to come?" "Absolutely, old sport." Daisy went upstairs to wash her face. Too late, I thought, with humiliation of my towels, while Gatsby and I waited on the lawn. "My house looks well, doesn't it?" he demanded. "See how the whole front of it catches the light?" I agreed that it was splendid. "Yes." His eyes went over it. Every arched door and square tower. "It took me just 3 years to earn the money that bought it." "I thought you inherited your money." "I did, old sport," he said automatically, "but I lost most of it in the big panic. The panic of the war. I think he hardly knew what he was saying, for when I asked him what business he was in, he answered, "That's my affair," before he realized that it wasn't an appropriate reply.
When Gatsby's guard is down, the truth comes out. This reiterates that Gatsby came from no money and he is lying about his background.
"Oh, I've been in several things," he corrected himself. "I was in the drug business, and then I was in the oil business, but I'm not in either one now." He looked at me with more attention. "Do you mean you've been thinking over what I proposed the other night?" Before I could answer, Daisy came out of the house, and 2 rows of brass buttons on her dress gleamed in the sunlight. "That huge place there?" she cried, pointing. "You like it?" "I love it, but I don't see how you live there all alone. I keep it always full of interesting people, night and day. People who do interesting things, celebrated people."
Gatsby's now in his element and he will be trying to prove to Daisy that he is worthy of her love. But there's kind of a problem. She's married.
Instead of taking the shortcut along the Sound, we went down to the road and entered by the big postern. With enchanting murmurs, Daisy admired this aspect or that of the feudal silhouette against the sky. Admired the gardens, the sparkling odor of jonquils, and the frothy odor of hawthorn and plum blossoms, and the pale gold odor of kiss me at the gate. It was strange to reach the marble steps and find no stir of bright dresses in and out the door, and hear no sound but bird voices in the trees. And inside, as we wandered through Marie Antoinette music rooms and restoration salons, I felt that there were guests concealed behind every couch and table, under orders to be breathlessly silent until we had passed through. As Gatsby closed the door of the Merton College library, I could have sworn I heard the owl-eyed man break into ghostly laughter.
I think this would be so cool in order to work on and think about of like to research and then to like create a layout of what you think Gatsby's home would look like, like complete with designs and everything. I don't know. I can always just imagine like if you're a Sims player, you could go into the build mode and create it that way. You could do like an online 3D model like Figuro or Minecraft or even Google Drawing because y'all know that I love my Google Drawing.
We went upstairs, through period bedrooms swathed in rose and lavender silk and vivid with new flowers, through dressing rooms and pool rooms and bathrooms with sunken baths, intruding into one chamber where a disheveled man in pajamas was doing liver exercises on the floor. It was Mr. Klipspringer, the boarder. I had seen him wandering hungrily about the beach that morning. Finally, we came to Gatsby's own apartment, a bedroom and a bath, and an Adam study, where we sat down and drank a glass of some chartreuse he took from a cupboard in the wall.
I thought Daisy and Gatsby didn't drink. I mean, chartreuse is a French liqueur that's either green or yellow, and it's made by Carthusian monks since 1737. There's a commercial just waiting to be made.
He hadn't once ceased looking at Daisy, and I think he revalued everything in his house according to the measure of response it drew from her well-loved eyes. Sometimes, too, he stared around at his possessions in a dazed way, as though in her actual and astounding presence none of it was any longer real. Once he nearly toppled down a flight of stairs.
Okay, here's a question for you. Why does Gatsby revalue his possessions as Daisy tours his mansion? Why is her reaction so important to him?
His bedroom was the simplest room of all, except where the dresser was garnished with a toilet set of pure, dull gold. Daisy took the brush with delight and smoothed her hair, whereupon Gatsby sat down and shaded his eyes and began to laugh. "It's the funniest thing, old sport," he said hilariously. "I can't. When I try to—" He had passed visibly through 2 states and was entering upon a third. After his embarrassment and his unreasoning joy, he was consumed with wonder at her presence. He had been full of the idea so long, dreamed it right through to the end, waited with his teeth set, so to speak, at an inconceivable pitch of intensity. Now, in the reaction, he was running down like an overwound clock.
This is so cute. Gatsby's just overcome with the reality of Daisy in his presence. So why has Gatsby dreamed of Daisy for 5 years? Is she worth it? Is the dream realistic? I mean, what will he do now that his dream is right in front of him? And why is he running down like an overwound clock? Remember that clock from earlier? And then what could that clock, that he nearly knocked over from earlier, what could that clock represent, especially with it being knocked over? Remember back to chapter 1, you guys. Ultimately, what will happen to Gatsby?
Recovering himself in a minute, he opened for us 2 hulking patent cabinets, which held his massed suits and dressing gowns and ties, and his shirts piled like bricks in stacks a dozen high. I've got a man in England who buys me clothes. He sends over a selection of things at the beginning of each season, spring and fall. He took out a pile of shirts and began throwing them, one by one, before us. Shirts of sheer linen and thick silk and fine flannel, which lost their folds as they fell and covered the table in many-colored disarray. While we admired, he brought more, and the soft, rich heap mounted higher. Shirts with stripes and scrolls and plaids and coral and apple green and lavender and faint orange, with monograms of Indian blue. Suddenly, with a strained sound, Daisy bent her head into the shirts and began to cry stormily. "They're such beautiful shirts," she sobbed, her voice muffled in the thick folds. "It makes me sad because I've never seen such beautiful shirts before."
Okay, first, why throw the shirts? Why can't he just open the cabinets and show them off? That bothers me. Now, remember the last time that Daisy cried in the novel? It was, well, besides this chapter, it was when she chose Tom or Gatsby the night before she was going to get married. So why do you think she's crying now? And what do all of those shirts represent? I mean, she's really looking at the what could have been. You know, had she gone and gotten out of that tub and been like, you know what? Choosing the poor guy. I gotta go. Her life would have been completely different. Would she have been happier? I mean, she is kind of vapid. She does love Tom. She loves her kid. At least I think she does. I'd imagine she does. But I don't know. It's the what could have been.
After the house, we were to see the grounds and the swimming pool, and the hydroplane and the midsummer flowers. But outside Gatsby's window it began to rain again, so we stood in a row looking at the corrugated surface of the Sound.
The weather started to rain again. What does this symbolize?
"If it wasn't for the mist, we could see your home across the bay," said Gatsby. "You always have a green light that burns all night at the end of your dock." Daisy put her arm through his abruptly, but he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to the great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now it was again a green light on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by 1.
What does the green light represent to Gatsby? And now that he has Daisy in his life again, how will this impact his decisions?
I began to walk about the room, examining various indefinite objects in the half-darkness. A large photograph of an elderly man in yachting costume attracted me, hung on the wall over his desk. "Who's this?" That's Mr. Dan Cody, old sport." The name sounded faintly familiar. "He's dead now. He used to be my best friend years ago."
How mysterious. Who could Mr. Dan Cody be to Gatsby?
There was a small picture of Gatsby, also in yachting costume, on the bureau. Gatsby with his head thrown back defiantly, taken apparently when he was about 18. "I adore it," exclaimed Daisy. "A pompadour? You never told me you had a pompadour, or a yacht." "Look at this," said Gatsby quickly. "Here's a lot of clippings about you."
Oh, notice how quickly Gatsby changed the subject when Daisy said he never told her he had a yacht. So what does this indicate? He never had a yacht. I mean, he was on a yacht, obviously, but he didn't own it. So who do you think could have owned it based upon this conversation? It would be Dan Cody.
They stood side by side, examining it. I was going to ask to see the rubies when the phone rang and Gatsby took up the receiver. "Yes. Well, I can't talk now. I can't talk now, old sport. I said a small town. He must know what a small town is. Well, he's no use to us if Detroit is his idea of a small town." He rang off.
More mysteries. First, Philadelphia called him, and now he's talking about Detroit. And both were known for mob connections.
"Come here, quick!" cried Daisy at the window. The rain was still falling, but the darkness had parted in the west, and there was a pink and golden billow of foamy clouds above the sea. "Look at that," she whispered. And then, after a moment, "I'd like to just get one of those pink clouds and put you in it and push you around."
Okay, this is kind of strange, but okay. I mean, the pink cloud's very dreamlike, so maybe Daisy's open to being with Gatsby? I mean, maybe. Oh, it's kind of creepy and weird. Well, it's not really creepy. It's just weird. Side note, remember at the end of chapter 1 when it's described that Daisy is the same as Tom. Both of them like to be in the center of attention. And right now, she's not in the center of Tom's attention. But how could she very easily get there? By using Gatsby, of course.
I tried to go then, but they wouldn't hear of it. Perhaps my presence made them feel more satisfactorily alone. "I know what we'll do," said Gatsby. "We'll have Klipspringer play the piano." He went out of the room, calling, "Ewing!" and returned in a few minutes, accompanied by an embarrassed, slightly worn young man with shell-rimmed glasses and scanty blonde hair. He was now decently clothed in a sports shirt, open at the neck, sneakers, and duck trousers of a nebulous hue. "Did we interrupt your exercises?" inquired Daisy politely. "I was asleep," cried Mr. Klipspringer, in a spasm of embarrassment. "That is, I'd been asleep. Then I got up." "Klipspringer plays the piano," said Gatsby, cutting him off. "Don't you, Ewing, old sport? I don't play well. I hardly play at all. I'm all out of practice." "We'll go downstairs," interrupted Gatsby. He flipped a switch. The gray windows disappeared as the house glowed full of light. In the music room, Gatsby turned on a solitary lamp beside the piano. He lit Daisy's cigarette from a trembling match and sat down with her on a couch far across the room, where there was no light save what the gleaming floor bounced in from the hall. When Klipspringer had played the Love Nest, he turned around on the bench and searched unhappily for Gatsby in the gloom.
So here's the song, so that way you can actually listen to it, and let's delve into the meaning.
Many builders there have been since the world began. Palace, cottage, mansion, inn, they have built for man. Some were small and some were tall, long or wide or low. But the best one of them all, Jack built long ago. 'Twas built in bygone days, yet millions sing its praise. Just a love nest, cozy and warm, like a dove rest down on a farm.
These lyrics really represent Daisy and whether or not she's going to leave her secure, materialistic, old money relationship with Tom versus going and giving everything up for Gatsby. And then look at the setting. Gatsby only turns on one lamp and then leads her into the darkness. In their own, I don't know, they're like in their own little love nest, but it has to be in the shadows. It can never be in the light. Oh, that's sad.
"I'm all out of practice, you see. I told you I couldn't play. I'm all out of practice." "Don't talk so much, old sport," commanded Gatsby. "Play." "In the morning, in the evening, ain't we got fun?" Outside, the wind was loud, and there was a faint flow of thunder along the sound. All the lights were going on in West Egg now. The electric trains, men carrying, were plunging home through the rain from New York. It was the hour of a profound human change, and excitement was generating on the air. One thing sure and nothing surer: the rich get richer, and the poor get children. In the meantime, in between time.
So here's a little clip of Ain't We Got Fun.
Till collectors gather round and rather on the parties next door. Men the grocer and the butcher sent, men who call for the rent. But within a happy Gatsby and his bride of only a year, seem to be so cheerful, here's an earful of the chatter you hear. Every morning, every evening, Ain't we got fun? Not much money, oh, but honey, ain't we got fun? The rent unpaid, dear, we haven't a fuss, but smiles are made, dear, for people like us. In the winter, in the summer, don't we have fun? Times are bum and getting bummer, still we have fun. There's nothing surer, the rich get rich and the poor get children. In the meantime, in between time, ain't we got fun?
Ain't We Got Fun is a song comparing the rich and the poor, and that's exactly what Gatsby and Daisy are, or they were. The only thing Gatsby would be able to offer Daisy is fun, whereas now she has other commitments, such as her role in society and her daughter.
As I went over to say goodbye, I saw that the expression of bewilderment had come back into Gatsby's face, as though a faint doubt had occurred to him as to the quality of his present happiness. Almost 5 years. There must have been moments, even that afternoon, when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams, not through her own fault, but because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. It had gone beyond her, beyond everything. He had thrown himself into it with a creative passion, adding to it all the time, decking it out with every bright feather that drifted his way. No amount of fire or freshness can challenge what a man will store up in his ghostly heart.
They've only been together for like a couple hours, and already Daisy isn't living up to his dream of what he thought their life would be like. So what does this foreshadow about their relationship?
As I watched him, he adjusted himself a little, visibly. His hand took hold of hers, and as she said something low in his ear, he turned toward her with a rush of emotion. I think that voice held him most, with its fluctuating, feverish warmth, because it couldn't be overdreamed. That voice was a deathless song. They had forgotten me, but Daisy glanced up and held out her hand. Gatsby didn't know me now at all. I looked once more at them, and they looked back at me, remotely, possessed by intense life.
Gatsby forces himself back in his dream when he hears her voice again. Remember that her voice is to make people think that they're closer to her than they really are. So, how does Daisy really feel about Gatsby? And what would she write in her journal when she got home that night? I mean, yes, she'd be able to relive some of her glory days, but remember, she chose Tom once. Will she choose Gatsby this time? And then before you solidify your answer, remember chapter 1. Nick is telling the story after it all happened, and Gatsby dies because people preyed on him. So at this point, who's the most likely to do this? Who would go and prey on Gatsby?
Then I went out of the room and down the marble steps into the rain, leaving them there together.
And that ends chapter 5. Daisy and Gatsby have been reunited, and at first it turned out super awkward, but now, it's looking pretty good. So I hope this has been helpful for you, and we'll see you in the next chapter.